What we're doing is creating a platform that allows you to run clinical programs and collect data that is ultimately then used by third parties, whether they're commercial or otherwise. The reality is that most patients want to feel they're contributing and they just want good care. For patients people that have interacted with patients, particularly with chronic, life-defying diseases, it's really hard for them sometimes to contribute to society. And the key is that this is giving them a very low burden, very transparent way of doing that. We're showing them how that's making a difference to other people with that same disease.
Hey everybody, this week I am joined again by Dr. Matt Wilson, who was on episode 76 of this podcast, the story of uMed and innovating clinical trials. We were just chatting off air, Matt, that was probably about 4 or 5 years ago. So I imagine a heck of a lot has changed since then. But for those that don't know and perhaps didn't listen to episode 76, former NHS doctor and anaesthetist, founder and CEO of uMed, and uMed are improving the lives of those living with disease by enabling access to the data and insights needed to bring new therapies and innovations to patients. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the platform. We're going to talk about, we were both actually saying we both should have listened to the previous episode to know sort of where to pick the story up. But I think what we'll do, let's assume that no one else has done that either. And we can sort of give the rundown of a quick version of your story and where you were 5 years ago, and then perhaps tell the story in more detail after that. But first of all, Matt, welcome. How are you doing, sir?
Yeah, no, very well. Thanks, James. I really appreciate you taking the time to have me on the podcast again. I was just saying, I can't believe it's 4 or 5 years ago. We were saying it's pre-pandemic, which just feels like a whole different life, doesn't it? Anyway, and it's kind of scary to think that from uMed's perspective as well, that conversation was 5 years ago, and we've been going that long. So,
congrats for having a health tech company that's lasted 5 years, mate.
Well, thanks. Yeah, we're a dwindling number now. So, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we're doing well, and but yeah, I still can't believe it's been that long. So, and a lot has happened, and really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come on.
You're very welcome. Looking forward to getting into it. First of all, whereabouts are you speaking to us from, Matt? Where are you based these days? So I'm based in Boston now. So, actually our offices are in Cambridge, just outside of Boston. And I actually live just in the suburbs as well. As we were saying, we've got 2 young kids, and sort of downtown Boston isn't probably the best place to raise 2 young kids. But so, we're out in the suburbs, and our offices are now, based in Cambridge. So we moved our headquarters of the company from London to Boston about 9 months ago now, and we've brought some of the key senior leadership over. We've made a couple of kind of key senior hires here. We've still got a lot of the team back in the UK, but we're very much headquartered here. Awesome. Well, listen, man. As I say, normally we get you to tell the long version of the story, but let's both assume that you did that last time. So maybe a quicker version. How do you go from Arctic warfare to medicine to starting uMed? And tell us all about uMed.
Yeah, so my very brief background is that I was an anaesthetist in the NHS and obviously doctor, and I was a sponsored undergraduate sponsored by the Navy to go through medical school, and that meant that after my time in med school and after my foundation years in the NHS, I went away for 3 years to go and play war, effectively. And I was very lucky. I did my commando training, which meant that I was then working primarily with the Royal Marines. And I was very lucky. I got to spend a lot of time in all sorts of different places, as you mentioned, like doing Arctic warfare in Norway. Did quite a lot of bits and pieces in the Middle East. Spent time on ships. East of Europe, in sort of Albania, that kind of area. And it was great. I don't think it was necessarily particularly good experience or training for either being a doctor or being a health tech CEO. Explicitly, I don't think you would kind of design that as your training program. But it was great fun. And I think the one thing I'd say it did give me is, a sort of early insight into leadership. which I think as a doctor, if you just go through the NHS route, you don't necessarily get that exposure early on to leadership roles. Whereas I had a small team of about eight guys who I was responsible for, and I was the doctor for a group of about 700 Royal Marines at different times, and so which was great fun and a huge responsibility for somebody that was still essentially a junior doctor. But from that, I always, like, during the end of that time, and again, forgive me if I've told this story on the last one, but I actually was flying to Norway for an exercise, and I picked up a magazine at the airport, which was Startup magazine, and I don't know why I picked it up, and I started reading some of the stories in there, and I was like, wow, this sounds really exciting. Yeah, and I think there was one who's the founder of Box, and a couple of others, and I was like, this seems like the autonomy that I've been sort of wanting, because I think my experience of both being a doctor and in the military in these kind of big, large organizations is I had all of these exciting ideas. I wanted to do things, and for all the right reasons, it's hard to make change in those big organizations. And what I was reading in this magazine was these founders who had agency and autonomy to kind of create ideas and then go and see if they could execute them. And that started to really appeal to me. And so uMed was then born. It had the sort of original ideas started forming around 2015. And it had as a lot of startups do, a sort of, a challenging sort of midwifery stage of trying to be born. And so it took a few years for us to really find our kind of North Star and focus. And so what uMed is now was sort of officially born at the end of 2018, early 2019. And since, and then the pandemic happened, which was actually great sort of timing for us in the sense that we were just ready at that point to really start running large scale clinical studies and supporting clinical studies in a number of ways. So that, as awful as it was quite helpful timing for us, because it allowed us and it gave us, a lot of people were looking for solutions that could support studies in an innovative way. And it gave us a little bit of a nudge that kind of helped us develop some of our earlier programs and onwards from there. And I can talk a bit more about what uMed does in the platform if it's helpful.
Awesome. You mentioned that the tough midwifery stage and that sort of 3 years until 2018-ish that you mentioned, it sort of became what it broadly is now, and then obviously changing going forwards after that. Can you just talk a little bit about that for me? Because I think that's quite relatable I love that you've just been honest about that, right? That it took 3 years to birth the thing. Like, I think there's so many people that just assume, and I have it with listeners as well, like that ask me when I'm out and about, like they're shocked that absolutely nobody, I think there's one person actually that I've had on this podcast that has basically said, I went to the pub, had 4 pints, and on the way home, bang, there was the idea. Brilliant idea. Yeah. Which even again, you're like, really? Was it like most people have stared at the wall for 6 years and done a PhD in it and educated in it, or they've worked in it for so long, and all of a sudden, eventually they iterate their way to something that sort of flops into existence and gets changed and stuff before it actually becomes a rush. So I think that's a really relatable way to explain like how you founded a company. So what was that period like? And I guess talk me through the pivoting and changing and everything to actually find product market fit.
So I think it's really interesting, because I think unless you're a genuine genius, I think you have to be pretty arrogant to think that, if it's something simple, if it's something that you can go down to the pub and have a few pints and suddenly have this epiphany, either you're an extremely unusual human being and brighter than all the rest of us, or maybe you've just got extremely lucky. But the reality is there's 7 billion people on the planet. You probably you're not the only person to have had this originating thought. There's a lot of clever people and a lot of clever people in healthcare. So I think coming from a starting point of you probably, no matter how clever you think your kind of conceptual idea is, there are other people that have thought about things in, I'm sure, a similar way, even if they haven't come across describing it in quite the way that you have. And so in my opinion, what kind of differentiates is the execution piece, right? So, and actually, how do you build that out into a successful company that's going to be, ultimately profit making and scalable? And I think that's where, for me, the original ideas I had around uMed weren't scalable, and they weren't, and they were still focused on clinical evidence, but it was much more around how could we create a consensus forum around that kind of evidence to be able to support clinical practice, and in a kind of sort of social type way where we would get physicians and others to be able to kind of comment on that. And again, there was other examples of things that weren't doing quite the same, but the problem is it came down to some poor execution or naivety on my part in that early stage of how much it would actually cost to acquire a critical mass of people onto that, to make it work. And then subsequently that allowed me to kind of really understand. And again, I think I always say this to people is, I'm a doctor by background. I didn't do an MBA.
Yeah.
I had to learn this stuff the kind of hard way, which is actually, unit economics are really important. Which sounds pretty obvious to anybody that's done any business. But actually as a sort of naive doctor coming into this, without any business experience, I had to kind of learn that. And actually in the early days, the first kind of conceptual idea, the cost per user acquisition was extremely high, and actually the long-term value of that was questionable, and also made a lot of errors in terms of kind of early execution and focus and how we spent money early on. But through that, the good part of that is that and I was able to kind of retain some of our early angels and the engagement of early angels sufficiently to get them to see that this was progressing into something that was changing and turning into something much more exciting and scalable. And so I was lucky, but again, hopefully it came, with I explained to my early investors, who were individual angels at that time, why we needed to pivot. And actually I was very lucky that they stuck with me and then gave me a little bit of extra cash that allowed me to kind of pivot to what we've got now, which again, when we launched that, it became it's still, it's always hard, but it was a bit of a epiphany for me, because I suddenly realized that assuming we can do X, Y, and Z, actually the end of this, the fundamental sort of economics of this business and its impact, which is what I wanted to achieve, were going to be much greater than what that original concept was. So, and I think through the way as well, just being in the space gives you an opportunity to speak to people. Having done something gives you you start to build a network of people and people that are interested to give you advice, and not all of it's good, but you can speak to people, and that sort of, then allows you to iterate on that idea. And it comes back to your point, right? I think very few people have this, incredible, sort of, apple on the head, sort of bathtub, whatever type moment. And, what really it is hard work and iteration, and actually taking a good idea and then iterating into something that's great. Yeah. And I think that's what I've seen in terms of other companies out there that have been really successful. And the problem is, I think you've got bias as well. Just to say, I think that the problem is that in media, and you only hear of these like exceptional companies, like Twitter that never did any marketing ever, or other examples of companies which are the exceptions, not the rules. You never hear about the companies that kind of just grew through hard work and became really successful, but actually, it took 15 years, or something. You don't hear about that. You don't hear about those founder stories.
It's true, man. And I actually think that that's a barrier to lots of things being done, because you're absolutely right. It's not very glamorous. It's not very glamorous to talk about, like, I stared at the wall for so long until I realized like something could actually, like, I literally watched paint dry and figured out a different way to dry the paint. Like, that's Like, it's not glamorous. And so you're right. The relationship, and obviously I'm close to this, but like the relationship between that and media is an interesting one. People only want to read about things that are interesting, that you can make interesting. So therefore you only write about the things that sound interesting. So everything is made to sound a bit more interesting, but then it sets really high standards for what the average person thinks is required to start a company. So people might be listening to this thinking like, I need that light bulb moment. The apple needs to fall on my head so I can figure out what gravity is. Like, I need to fit, like, something needs to happen to me in order for me to start a company, because again, like, and then I can raise funding, and then it can be big, and then it can be a real thing. And it's like, no, there's actually quite a lot of things that you can do that are relatively simple, that solve a small problem that you don't need to raise money for, and you can have a business that actually you can exit for 3-4 times revenue, whatever, and like live a very good life.
Exactly.
But we're not really told that. I also think, man, like in your journey, like the humility to actually just change is a really important one. Like, you're someone that very much sort of sounds like you're top of your game in like things that you do. You don't do things by halves. And I think it's quite a confronting moment, I imagine anyway, for you as that founder. You know, you've been a military medic, you've been an anaesthetist, you've been top of your game in like a lot of things. And so, you know, you might have had assumptions that, or in fact, we all do, that you talked about the naivety of starting a company. Like, I hear this on a few episodes. I wouldn't have started my company had I have known the nonsense that would have entailed afterwards, you know. Like, there is that naivety, but I think it also requires humility to look at it and go, do you know what? I need to pivot. I've smashed all this money, like trying to plug something that didn't work, tail between legs. I've got to go and ask the investors for a bit more cash. But I'll tell you what, I've done the hard work, and actually this now I think will work for all these reasons. I've learnt my lessons, and there's a lot of humility involved in that as well. And I think that's also a barrier to people to starting companies, thinking that it needs to work first time because of they've got, you know, all these followers on Instagram from school, and they're gonna think blah blah blah, or what, you know, whatever it is.
And you're right. It is hard actually as well, because like, just from a family and friends point of view, you do get a lot of people like what are you doing, Matt? Like, I was
you had it all.
I was on that kind of motorway to becoming a consultant, and and you're like, why would you? And especially then, you know, when it didn't go well for those first few years, and it was a challenge. You know, you do get people looking at you a bit funny, being like, what are you doing now? Just go back to like you know, doing what I enjoyed it as well. I loved being an anaesthetist, and and you do like, what am I doing here? Am I doing something? But one thing I think that actually really helps with being a doctor is, I remember at the first day of med school, when I started, I went to Cardiff University, and the dean it was quite a big intake, it was about 300 people, and he said, look, all of you have come from, you know, you've all got A's at A level, and you've probably been in the top sort of, you know, 1 or 2% of your year at school. Just so you know, everybody here is the same. So if you think you're special, you're not. And actually, it was quite a nice kind of moment, actually, because it's true. I think a lot of people, you know, if you haven't been checked in terms of actually you're not actually that special. There's a lot of people out there. You might be good at doing exams, but actually, you know, that doesn't mean that you're going to be successful, or that you've got something that other people don't. And I want to kind of question back to you, if you don't mind, actually, James. Is one of the things I think is happening in the kind of health tech and broader investment space, is that sort of classic Silicon Valley overconfidence, you know, the Elizabeth Holmes kind of persona. It feels to me that there is now a shift away from that, and that there's a recognition that, particularly in health tech, but I'm sure it's true in probably other areas, that actually that sort of unchecked excessive confidence without humility is probably not a good virtue. But I was interested, because that's the perception that I've got, but I don't know if that's me being biased.
I think you're right.
More my own.
No. I think you're right, and I think there's a really interesting relationship between startups, media, and investors. I think there's a really interesting triangle there, and I think what's happened is health tech's been relatively new, and over time, or let's actually talk about, so when health tech kind of erupted and boomed, we had a load of investors come in, and forgive the term, but uneducated investments in health tech investors. So investors that come in investing on emotion, whilst not knowing the difference between a class 2B and a class 3 medical device. And I think what's happened, you could play that out a bit more broadly as well, to even say that a lot of the early health tech companies were sort of logistics companies. Take like the online pharmacy, like take Echo that got acquired by McKesson, right? It's like Stephen, the founder, I know quite well. Like, it's like a logistics company, really, like at its heart. But then starts playing in health tech, and then has to start being a bit more specific in certain areas because of health tech, but that was the unknown bit.
Yes.
Yeah. So it didn't require health tech investors necessarily, and they didn't from what I know and understand. But I think what's happened is, as we've gone on through time, and health tech has become more of a solid space, the investors have actually become more educated. There are specific health tech investors in the more generalist funds. There are specific health tech practices. There are specific health tech funds even that have cropped up with specific, health tech related LPs that know and care about this stuff, and institutionals that are hospital groups or insurance groups, or, those types of things as LPs, which then obviously goes down to the VCs, etc. So I think what's happened is that people have also simultaneously become very aware of hype, that we're very aware of what a hype cycle looks like. Yeah. It's why the sort of boom in LLMs hasn't really affected healthcare that much, I don't think. People have been talking about it, but they've been talking about it with a healthy dose of cynicism. Yeah. I think simply because we've seen this before, and perhaps because you and I, when it's not our first rodeo, we're seeing our second, third cycle of this sort of stuff now as well. So maybe it's our position in it as well that we think this sort of stuff.
It's like we're not getting it.
It's
amazing when uMed in that sort of 2018 period. Like I had a lot of pressure to be like, why aren't you building uMed on an underlying kind of blockchain? And like you honestly,
so
like
interesting.
A lot of pressure, and to be like you. And I remember speaking to somebody, and they're like, if you don't do this, you're gonna be left behind. You're gonna miss and you're like, really? And then like I try to dive into it. I'm like, I don't see what value this adds to me or my customers. Or anybody. I don't get it. And so like, thankfully we didn't. But it's surprising how easy it is to be kind of influenced by that hype cycle. And the problem is investors are not immune to it as well. And
correct.
The LLM thing, again, I've had there is a huge amount of opportunity for us to actually integrate LLMs. We're already using them in a superficial way, but actually the whole point of uMed, as you'll hear in a minute, is like we're building this kind of unique engine that allows us to build customizable data sets that can support clinical research in a consented and academically rigorous way. And actually is that foundation is to me the most important thing, because then once you've got that uniqueness, you can build layers of tools and AI that can then leverage that underlying unique data sets.
So everyone is saying the word LLM. Everyone's saying LLMs to you. Everyone's saying large language models to you. Everyone's like, chucking that in.
and unless they're like, what's your, how are you, how are you? And I don't know if you get sort of strictly VC, the investor newsletter. There's a newsletter that's written by somebody in Silicon Valley, and every day it tells you who's like the companies that have been invested. It's a good read actually. It's and they've got a few other bits, but I honestly, in the last year, I think 90% of the companies in somewhere in their little blurb have got AI or. You're like, it's hard because then investors again are not immune to this, and they're like, unless these are the companies that are getting investment, so what's your story that's going to allow you to kind of fall into that? And it's a hard line to tread, because then they're not wrong, right? Objectively, those companies are the ones that are getting investment, so you could be really sort of closed-minded and be like, no, I don't care. Like this is what we do. We're not an AI company at its basis. But then, if you're not in the, if you're not getting engagement, and it's even true of customers, again, our life science organizations that we work with, top tier life science organizations, their CEOs are getting pressure from their shareholders to be like, how are you using AI to include your business? So that trickles down all the way to us.
Yeah.
And, when we're having conversations with them saying, how are you integrating AI tools into this? And you're like, okay. So it's amazing how there's these sort of external forces actually kind of drive elements of your business. And it's difficult sometimes to be able to know which of those to kind of get in the river and kind of go along with versus, be like, no, that's not our business. And as I say, I think for us actually much more differently than blockchain, I think there is definitely value in us integrating
utility,
utility in what we're doing at various different levels, but that's very different from being a sort of AI first company where, which I think a lot of people are positioning themselves as, and I'd say questionably in many positions.
Indeed. So moving on to uMed, we talked around it for so long, we can talk to it now. How do you describe it now? You gave the sort of one sentence version, but I guess very practically, just tell us about uMed and the product itself.
Yeah. So the underlying kind of starting point for uMed and my background as a doctor, I recognize the fact that the vast majority of patients aren't offered the opportunity to be part of research. And it's because their healthcare institutions don't have the capability, often the expertise and bandwidth to be able to offer their patients research. And so as a result of that, you get these pockets of opportunity, which is a real problem. Not only is it a problem for patients because they're not being offered research, but it's also a problem for the industry that are trying to develop new therapies and new insights that are going to help patients because they're getting misrepresented samples of patients and just a smaller number of them as well. So we said, look, can we create a technology platform that's embedded within inside a healthcare network that wraps our arms around that healthcare network and creates an enabler for them to be able to offer their patients research without creating burden for them. And that's at its basis what we've done there. So it's allowing us to identify patients, engage them, and then what we've created is this very comprehensive data collection platform that allows us to be able to use that to either support external clinical trials that are already running, or as you'll hear a bit more about, we're now running our own clinical studies in collaboration with various disease charities in order to be able to create a very unique mechanism for building clinical evidence and insights that doesn't exist currently, or hasn't previously existed. It does now, but it didn't previously exist.
So the last 4 years then, or last 5 years, however long it's been since you were last on, you talked about like pivoting and changing and landing on this. So it's kind of a unique opportunity to talk about this actually, because it's a time frame that I sort of say in jest that to be around for 5 years as a health tech company is a bit of a thing, let alone obviously achieving that scale and growth. So you mentioned going to the investors, pivoting, getting the extra bit of cash, doing the pivot. How do you go from there to where you are now in terms of like acquiring those customers, building team, like all that sort of stuff? There are lots and lots and lots of companies that are trying to do something in the clinical trial space with technology to make things better, because as we all know, huge spend, you make 0.1% a difference. You're going to save so much money, enough to exit on as a company if you can attract that in revenue. So there's a lot that can be done. There's lots of people trying to do it. Achieving that, though, is different. Actually managing to stay alive as a company or to actually scale is very different. So finding product market fit, finding the customers, doing the sales and actually growing is difficult. Even perhaps finding who the right customer is and all that sort of stuff, and the way to sell. You mentioned the model there with charities, etc. So how did you go from there to where we are now?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to this sort of idea of sort of iteration, and the fact that I think it's extremely difficult to go from zero to where, even to where we are now, let alone where we want to be in kind of 5 or 10 years time. So what you have to do is kind of build a roadmap of progressive milestones that you can achieve with inside realistic timeframes and VC timeframes that allow you to prove that you're on the path to that bigger addressable market and bigger impact. And for us, that was building the first institutional network, which was GPs in the UK. We now have about 6 million patients sort of worth of GPs on our platform, which represents about 10% of the English population. But getting the first GPs on board was really key, and that then allowed us to then start doing the first studies, the first support programs with that small GP network. But obviously you can't do big studies because you've only got a small number of GPs. So it was then about kind of looking for those programs which we could deliver with inside that relatively small group of GPs. So it was with, smaller other health tech companies, smaller, and shout out to Hakim Yadi at Closed Loop Medicine, actually, who, I don't know if you've interviewed him, but he's a brilliant guy and actually was one of our first, one of the very first programs that we ran through uMed, and one of the studies that they were doing. And so it was about matching those up, and another small device company that we were able to do a validation program for them using that small network. And that allowed us to kind of not only generate some revenue, but it also allowed us to show all of the kind of proof points of the platform. Could we actually access the electronic health record data in a compliant and rigorous way? Could we engage patients? Would the patients actually engage with the way in which we're doing this? What are the issues actually? What do the conversion rates look like? What do the stats look like? And that comes back to this unit economics. Suddenly you can start telling the story of actually we've dramatically reduced the cost of acquiring a patient into a cohort program, whatever that is, whether it's for an external clinical trial or whether it's for a registry like we're running. You can start showing those metrics of saying, traditionally it costs, $10,000, $15,000 to recruit and retain a patient in a registry style model. We're now doing it for less than $2. So you can start showing those metrics through those early programs, and that then gives you that sort of checkpoint where you can raise a bit more capital, and then you can start being more ambitious, expanding that network further, and then that opens up that opportunity to do more ambitious programs. So in the early days of uMed, we were very much focused on using the platform to support trial recruitment. So we weren't running our own studies. We were using this purely as a mechanism to recruit into studies that were already being run. So phase 2, 3 clinical trials, academic programs. And because that was a very clear pain point, it was something that was kind of understood by all of the stakeholders, including the patients, very clearly. And it was something we could pick off. The problem is that, being a recruitment vendor, and it's an interesting, but potentially slightly sort of controversial point, but the problem is that, recruitment doesn't scale to a venture-sized business. And because of a whole bunch of reasons, which if we're interested, we can go into. But it was a very important stepping stone for us in terms of demonstrating the model, demonstrating some of the unit economic metrics, and also just getting trust. And I think one of the key things that I'm really proud of is the relationship that we've got with both healthcare providers and patients. We've worked really hard to emphasize the fact that we take as seriously, if not more seriously, the relationship with patients, data governance, privacy, and so we've been able to show that, we've now engaged hundreds of thousands of patients for different studies, and through that we've been able to show that this process works, and that the governance structure that sits behind it stands up to challenge. And that I think has also been really important, because you can't do anything in healthcare without that trust. And so those are some of the kind of key milestones that's allowed us to get to this point. And then from there, you can start being more ambitious. And the end game for us was always about using this not just for trial recruitment, but to be able to create a new model for thinking about building clinical evidence, which is creating these rolling consented cohorts of patients, and then using our comprehensive data collection platform to be able to pull in health records, to be able to collect patient-reported outcomes, to collect samples. We're now collecting genetic samples from patients in our Parkinson's cohort, and sending out devices and things like that. And actually, that we'd have never been able to do that if we were launching that at day one, because we wouldn't have had all of those previous proof points and trust with both customers and with healthcare institutions to be able to then have that much more ambitious next step.
Awesome. Yeah. And it really accelerated at the end. It went from, that was awesome. So yeah, there's a bit that you talked about at the end here that I just want to get some clarity on. So you go from assisting with recruitment, phase 2-3 trials, other, research things, bits and bobs, and you prove that recruitment model. I think there's something interesting there about you being very deliberate around investor milestones as well, and actually plotting where your raise points are on this story. I think that's just an interesting to pull out. Actually, I'm not sure that I hear that often. I know that a lot of people will do it, but you've actually called out something very deliberate.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because as I say, you obviously have to present to investors what the big hairy vision is, or whatever the big, the 1B plus vision. But especially these days, I think there's a lot more skepticism about the path to get there than I think there was, 3 years ago, where you with bravado and some
lack of IPOs will do that, won't it?
Lack of IPOs will do that, and exactly, and you can get some celebrities, in the industry, and you can share this vision, and that was kind of enough to get. Now, I think, to your point, I think the investors have seen several cycles of healthcare data companies, health tech companies, and I think they're getting their own data about what that path looks like and where they fail. And so I think it's really important. And hopefully some of the success we've had is that we have been very deliberate in saying it's going to take time. And I think one, being really transparent with investors, and we're very lucky. We've got some brilliant investors that understand that in healthcare and health tech, and life sciences, is you have to go through a sequential set of proof points in order to be able to win, and get the trust of both healthcare providers, but also customers. A large pharma company, and we now work with 4-5 of the top 10 pharma companies in different programs, which is really exciting. But there's no way they're going to cut you a check for hundreds of millions to run a pivotal, to be a critical part of a important program, whether it's a phase 2-3 study, or whether it's a broader data acquisition, evidence generation program. They're never going to cut you that check for 7+ figures from the get go, right? They're gonna they need to, and that doesn't necessarily have to have been a pilot with them. That helps, but having that kind of body of internal evidence to show that you can actually execute on this. Because I always think you have to think about the person, whoever is cutting that check to run that program with you, it's their reputation on the line. They're taking a big step in working with a company that otherwise they probably haven't heard of. So how do you de-risk that for them? How do you make it easy for them to go to their boss and say, look, I know this is a bit unusual. We could just go to do what we always do and use, a big CRO. I always say, nobody gets fired for using McKinsey, right? Like,
exactly.
That's the, not in health tech necessarily, but, actually giving them the tools to be able to go to their bosses and say, look, this is worth us taking a risk, because it is a risk. Then you have to be realistic for them. That's what it is, of using potentially a vendor that isn't established in the market, or isn't established in that particular piece. So it's so these kind of intentional milestones, I think, are really important to lay out for everybody, not just investors, but also for customers as well, who you need to build that trust and confidence throughout that whole process. And I think we've done that very successfully, which I think has really helped.
Yeah, it's really good and clearly important to be so deliberate about it as well. I want to talk about what you mentioned right at the end there, which is essentially in part the vision, but actually it's actually what is being executed right now by uMed. You talked about this new model for evidence generation, and then you said rolling cohorts of patients, genetic testing, Parkinson's, sending out devices. There was a lot in a very short sentence there. So can you paint this picture for me? What is this vision? What is this new model for evidence? And put some flesh around the bones of some of these examples that you've just mentioned there.
Yeah. So if you think about what we do at the moment, so when we're looking to answer a research question, we find a group of patients, we collect a load of data, and then we throw those patients away. And next time we have a research question in the same disease area, we recruit again and collect that data. So fundamentally what uMed's doing is saying, let's build a living cohort of patients that are research interested and consented into a longitudinal registry program. So not only have they said, yes, I'm interested in research, but they've also said, I want to be part of an explicit ethics approved IRB program where you can utilize data that is in my health record, but also data you collect from me at home through surveys, through, as I say, devices, through samples that we send to patients. And they are part of this living research cohort. And then underpinning that is three key pillars. So one is our network of healthcare institutions, and that provides us the source of patients and also allows us, with the patient's consent, to be able to link their health record data. The second is the platform itself, and what we've created is this very comprehensive mechanism of not only recruiting patients, but also then collecting data from them in all of the modalities that I've just described, as well as linkage of health record. And then finally is the patients. And these the patients are really, are the fundamental basis of everything that we do in healthcare and life sciences. And so by creating these cohorts of patients with this very flexible protocol, we can go back to patients and answer multiple research questions sequentially. So to give a real example of this, we're working with a couple of examples. So one is that we're working with Queen Mary's University of London on our Parkinson's cohort. We've now got over 1,000 patients recruited into that program, UK and US. And what we're able to do, as well as pulling all of these data sets together, we can go back to patients. And so what we're doing there is actually is DNA. So we've got a partnership with a group called GP2, which is a global Parkinson's genetic program. And so with, again, the patient's consent, we're sending out DNA testing kits, working with Queen Mary's to sequence those as part of this GP2 program. But we also have this ability to link all this phenotypic data. So we're suddenly contributing a huge amount of not just genotype data, but phenotypic data that can then be used to really deeply understand some of the underlying genetic factors that are driving Parkinson's. So that's one example. And another is we're working with a company that has a drug in market for Parkinson's, for a specific subgroup of patients. And with this cohort, what we can start doing is doing real comparative effectiveness. So with their drug versus some of the other more established drugs on market. So we can actually start teasing out by going back to these patients and asking them, some very specific questions, additional questionnaires, and nurse-based interviews. We can actually tease out, is there a difference in patient outcomes between this group that are on this drug versus the existing standard of care, which is obviously really important for them to understand because it's a relatively new drug in market and they're trying to educate physicians and payers to what the benefits are. And most of those benefits are, it's difficult to elucidate all of them through your phase 2-3 clinical trials. So generating this customizable real world evidence, which isn't just looking at aggregated data sets, which is the kind of standard. So the companies, organizations like CPID in the UK, there's lots of companies in the US like Health Verity and others, which aggregate large amounts of EMR and claims data, importantly without patient consent as well. But the problem is that that data doesn't include the really key elements that you need in order to be able to really tease out that clinical effectiveness. Whereas we can enrich that with data from the patient, through questionnaires, through devices, through samples. And we can also bring patients back into clinic as well if we need to actually undertake certain assessments. So the underlying theme is this really comprehensive data platform that can then be reused across the whole life cycle of new therapies, and can really accelerate the whole process, which is, going back, is a much more exciting long-term vision than just the recruitment element, which is still important, but it creates this much larger opportunity.
Yeah, it creates a heck of an opportunity, and that's where my mind goes there. So how big is this vision? You've talked there about the Parkinson's example, et cetera, being used to essentially inform information about, the genetic origins, if such exist, of Parkinson's. That in itself just sounds like a very grand vision to just look at that, and that's a life's work almost just in there. But you obviously own a platform on which lots of this can now be done. So the limit in my mind is sort of, I don't know where the limit is. It's sort of like you're building a generational platform that lots of this work can be done. It just matters now who's going to fund it. And so ultimately, wherever, and then you look to the pharma companies, and I'm just riffing here, and feel free to stop me. But like then my mind goes, okay, now we're just dependent on the pharma companies to decide they're interested in something, that they're going to put resource behind finding a drug for blah, and therefore they're going to be the ones that are going to want to do stuff on this platform. So the more patients you have on the platform, the more people you have on the platform, the better. The more consented they are across everything, the better, because actually then those pharma companies can look at this as like a big menu and go, well, actually, here's the quite specific thing I want to ask for. I'm just going to put together a study based on everything that you own as part of uMed, and exactly. I'm just going to pay you for the privilege to execute on it. Is that sort of where this goes?
Exactly. You nailed it. And it's creating this, again, sort of platform for, rather than them having to create an entirely new study to answer a specific question or collect certain data, we can sort of pluralize that, and so we can create these consortiums. Sometimes we formalize those into actual consortiums, like we're doing at the moment around endpoints in Parkinson's, actually, to use another Parkinson's example. So multiple different organizations, some of them charities, some of them pharma companies, are contributing funding to a sort of shared platform to look at new clinical endpoints for clinical outcome measures in Parkinson's, because we know that the current measures aren't sensitive enough to be able to track disease progression for some of the new disease modifying drugs that are coming through. So that's one example. But the whole point is that, and we've got two others. We've got one in cardiometabolic disease, which now has about 3,000, just under 3,000 patients, and will be about 10,000 patients by the end of this year. And another in interstitial lung disease as well, which is both of which only launched about 4 months ago. So we've been able to recruit extremely quickly. But the whole point is that ultimately what I'd love, the long-term vision is actually for every patient, even healthy patients, to be offered the opportunity to be part of one of these longitudinal research cohorts. Because even healthy patients, there's a big focus on prodromal phase of disease now, where a lot of the disease modifying therapies need to be, we need to start getting better at identifying patients before they're actually diagnosed. And so having patients be part of a healthy cohort is something that we can do. And ultimately the goal is that, and it's entirely up to patients, this is the key thing as well, whether they want to participate, is you give them the opportunity, you explicitly consent them into these programs. And then, but once they're in, you create this fundamental living cohort of patients, which has the ability to pull in all of the data you need. It has the ability to customize that data based on the needs of that particular researcher or particular organization. And because it's got the institutional network that sits behind it, it also has the ability to support interventional studies as well, either through recruitment or actually running some of those programs through the cohort. So it's, and that's why I say it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about building clinical evidence.
And it's limitless.
And so for us, it's just going through those milestones, and we've shown, all of the key proof points about recruiting, retaining, being able to collect data in a rigorous academically, rigorous way and that has IRB approval, that has regulatory quality data that sits behind it, have all been proven. So it's now just that sort of trying to accelerate that growth of how quickly can we recruit patients in institutions, and then in parallel, how can we bring more and more researchers to use this? And it's important to emphasize that this is absolutely not just commercial research. We work extensively with academic researchers and charities, and the whole way in which the ethics that sits behind this is constructed is that it allows any researcher to be able to work with us. And actually the core data set that we've created is open. So any researcher can come and at no cost access that core data set. And then if they want to run additional programs through it, then that's the way in which we generate revenue, by running that. So it creates this really exciting way to bring lots of different groups of people together, to be able to leverage this patient cohort.
It's incredible, man. Can I ask you a stupid question? What do the patients get out of this? Are they just happy to be there and happy to be contributing to the future treatment of their disease or condition? Or do they get a share of the value being created in some way? And I'm just wondering where you sit, because you're a guy with good ethics, and as you seem from the setup of the company, right? Like where do you stand on that issue about patient data sharing and shared value and selling data, and the patients selling it to etc.? Like, I'm interested, like, where you sit on all of that stuff, being so close to it.
Yeah, and it's worth just explicitly calling out that what we're not doing is selling patient data even with the consent, just to be clear. Like, it's like what we're doing is creating a platform that allows you to run clinical programs and collect data that is ultimately then used by third parties, whether they're commercial or otherwise. But the point is this is not about aggregating NHS records and selling it. That's not what we do. There are other people that, may have that as an ambition, but that's absolutely not what we're doing. It's about running clinical studies. And, but to your point, I call this the sort of middle class fallacy, which is, I think, a lot of people who are relatively sort of wealthy and of a specific background who might read The Guardian, all have this belief that the way to engage patients and get them to contribute is by some financial exchange of value, or giving them their health records back, and I think you and I both worked in the NHS. The reality is that most patients want to feel they're contributing and they just want good care. And actually what we've done is we created a whole bunch of different ways in which we can work with patients to ensure that they are seeing reciprocity from their contributions. So one is just being very transparent with them. We're consenting patients. We're telling them exactly how any data that we collect from them is being used. If we are re-engaging them to collect additional data, we'll explain why and who we're doing that with. So just that level of transparency is something that patients aren't usually able to receive. And again, that creates this sort of trust and reciprocity. The second thing is that we always, we have regular newsletters that go out. We also send out ad hoc engagements to patients based on their contributions. So if one of our academic professors, like Professor Noyes, who works with us at Queen Mary's, if he's presenting a paper in Milan, we'll have a photo of him and send that out and say, because you contributed to this program, this is the paper this is the abstract that's being presented, and you wouldn't believe we have almost 100% open rate from our cohort of reading and reviewing that, because patients, for patients people that have interacted with patients, particularly with chronic, life-defying diseases, it's really hard for them sometimes to contribute to society. And the key is that this is giving them a very low burden, very transparent way of doing that, and we're showing them how that's making a difference to other people with that same disease. And honestly, that creates, we have of the patients we engage with a particular disease area to recruit to these cohort programs, we see between 20 and 25% of them fully consent into the program, and we have almost 100% retention rate after year one. And most of those people that have dropped out are generally people, unfortunately, that have passed away, not because they've actively opted out. So I think it's about communicating the importance of what this research does. And that being said, there are a few mechanisms we've got. So we do have the ability. So if we're asking patients to do something quite onerous, like a series of surveys or use a device, then what we do is, and it's slightly different in the UK and US. In the UK, we focused on saying, look, if you complete these surveys, we'll provide remuneration to a charity that's related to this disease area. So if you complete a set of surveys, we'll send £10 to Parkinson's UK, for example. And I haven't actually got any data to support this, but I think that and at some point we'll try to do this. I think if you did a direct comparison of engagement rates for direct remuneration versus giving money to charities, I think you'll get a higher completion rate with that charitable donation, because £10, and I think this is why a lot of these models, and again, a lot of them came in the kind of blockchain era with this idea of kind of direct remuneration to people for use of their health records. One, I don't think it requires a lot to get people to interact with that. I don't think most patients have the time or the bandwidth, or, and the headspace to really think, I'm going to download this app and I'm going to start, exchanging my health records. And also I think the unit economics don't work. I think, at an individual patient level, unless you're a very unique patient with a rare disease, like actually the amount of money, if we're being that cold about it, that you will be able to kind of generate from creating an exchange mechanism around your data, I think is extremely low for an individual patient. So I don't think it works. I think what you need to do is be very clear and transparent with patients, explain why ultimately, even if this research that they're contributing to won't directly affect them, it is fundamentally important for us to understand disease and get new therapies that are going to impact other people with their disease. And that single message, I think, is more important than anything else. In the US, we do have a mechanism to directly remunerate patients where it is a bit more of a transactional, it's much more common, for that to be the case, and it can be, and we can do it in a few different ways through vouchers and direct remuneration. But we only do that if we're asking patients to undertake a specific set of activity on top of the core data collection. So we've got, again, flexibility in the platform, but the key message is that we get incredible engagement and re-engagement rates without having to directly remunerate patients. And that's because we're explaining to them why this is so important. And we're showing them what that value is. One thing just as a plug, one thing we're trying to do actually, and we're going to launch hopefully in the end of this year, is, because, with these consented patients, we have a lot of detail about their disease. We know what medications they're on. We know what stage of disease they're at. So what we're actually doing is working with charities to use that data to actually retarget patients with educational material that's highly targeted to them. So rather than say, hi Matt, you've got, Parkinson's disease, here's a generic newsletter about Parkinson's. Actually, we can say, look, you're on opicapone and you've got hernia stage 3. Like, actually what we're going to do is we're going to send you educational material from one of the charities that specifically is relevant to you. And that's something that we're experimenting with as well, which I think will allow us to see even higher retention rates over time. Again, for me, it's just being transparent and reciprocity. How can we help patients understand that what they're doing is really important to, to society as a whole?
It's really interesting because, it's like, even in the way I phrased the question about, like, do they get a share of the value being created? It sounds like yes. And it sounds like it's in part horses for courses. There is direct remuneration. There are times where that's appropriate. But what's interesting is like what I'm getting from the way you're talking is that there's almost like a culture that's being created here, a culture of like give and take, but I don't mean that just so in such a basic way. It's like they are willing to give their data, and in the deal that's being done, it's like, do you want £5 or do you want to be part of something bigger? And by part of something bigger, I mean, I'm going to inform you of everything along the way. I'm going to really show you what this means, and you can take credit for having been part of that. And that as a package being more valuable than the pennies on the pound they're likely to get for their time and this, that, and the other, because of like what you would need to do financially in order to make that work at scale if it was direct remuneration.
And just some anecdotes about individual patients, because we have a patient services team, because as well as digitally engaging patients, we recognize that a lot of patients need additional support. So we have a team of nurses and support staff that help engage patients if we need to. But through that, we get quite a lot of feedback from patients. And which is really helpful. One of the things that's really, just some anecdotes, one of the patients who was involved in a study that we were doing was saying that she was bending the ear off of all of her relatives, telling them about the study that she was involved in. And, and when we told the patient about the results, again, it became the focus of her life for that sort of period of time. She was incredibly proud of it. She was a more elderly lady, and actually everybody, family, friends that she interacted with, that this was the kind of primary topic of conversation. Again, just think about how much more valuable that is than a £10 Amazon voucher, and again, I think the point is that they're not mutually exclusive, as we described. That we do have mechanisms where, if it's appropriate to, and if the ethics allows us to do so, we can remunerate patients, because we recognize that sometimes that's important to do and is fair. But I think the fundamental basis of this is I think pushing back on this idea, which became sort of in vogue, which is it has to be a transaction. Healthcare isn't transactional, right? It's something much more personal. For all of us that have worked with looked after patients, like it transcends monetary value. And I think a lot of the perhaps companies and startups that have tried to overly commoditize that have fallen foul of that fact. And I think one is that I think I think that's very hard to do from an ethical and legal perspective. But I think more importantly, I think it misrepresents what actually drives what's actually important to patients.
Yeah, there's an ecosystem that you upset when you do introduce money into that. There's a set of values that are working, and whilst you can argue that, well, you're coming in and monetizing stuff, it's like, well, not if I fairly compensate someone with value in a different way. And I think that's what you're saying, is that it becomes more comfortable, and I think it's about it in that way.
And for us as well, like in a way, we don't need to talk about that, because it's just about running studies, right? This is just about finding. It's just, and actually we don't need to have this, because what we're actually doing doesn't. Although the mechanism that we're doing it is much more efficient and fundamentally different, the underlying basis is we're recruiting patients into studies and we're collecting data from them, which you would do if you're in any clinical study anywhere in the world. And actually, and we're doing it with your explicit informed consent. And so, the underlying, and in clinical studies, they often do provide monetary remuneration, in terms of vouchers or compensation for travel and things like that. So all of that it fits inside the existing framework. I think the point that we're able to do, because we have this ability to directly re-engage patients and we have the underlying data, it means that we can make it much more personal, and we can also make it easier, of course, because the vast majority of the data that the engagement with patients is remote, so they don't have to physically come in, which is often a barrier.
I love that, man. just before I let you go, just back to the growth for a second. Deals with pharma. This is what everyone's looking for. So many digital health tech companies have got in their decks that they give to their seed investors, like, and then we'll do deals with pharma. Can you sort of break down the anatomy of a deal in pharma and how they come about and how they get done? Like, what is there a secret? Is there a hack that you can tell me right now? Like, here's the secret hack that gets everybody deals with pharma, or is it, as I expect, a lot of hard work and speaking to lots of people and trying to find the value, just as we've talked about, actually starting the company in the first place?
Yeah. You're not being surprised that the answer is going to be more focused on the latter. I do think there's some thoughtful ways of going about this that perhaps other people perhaps overlook. So I think one thing is, like sales 101 type thing. Like, understand who actually owns budget here, which is not the same person that you may be interacting with, who you're selling to. And again, I say this as though I'm a sales guy that have a background. I don't know, I've been picking this stuff up, but it's pretty obvious stuff, logical stuff, right? And I think what you and understand the dynamics of the risk that those individuals are taking. And then I think if you methodically go through, put yourself in their shoes and say, I'm VP of this particular molecule that's, at this stage, and I've got responsibility for whatever part of it. And I've come to you, what are the risks to me of working with you as a vendor? And what has that vendor done to mitigate all of those risks? And that can be a whole bunch of things, right? It can be contractual. It can be terms it writes, proof points from previous programs. Again, that's a really important thing. And so part of the way that, we did that, and it goes back to this idea of when we started with recruitment. Recruitment is quite a simple thing to sell to pharma, in the sense, like, you've got a study, you need patients, we've got patients. It's not a complicated, there's a very clear need. There's also a very clear process that sits behind that, where there's lots of recruitment vendors. So once we're able to say, look, we've got patients here, we can help you, and they agree with that, then actually you're on then a train. There's clear budget allocated. There's a clear process to get you into that vendor assessment process, and then you can get an MSA. And then once you've got the MSA, then you can start going, actually, we've got some other ways we can help you as well. And then when you're doing those more complex nuanced sales, you've already got an MSA, you've already got a track record with that company, even if it's within a different team. And that, going back to that original piece of how do you de-risk it for that person who's taking a punt on you as a vendor that they haven't used before, you're immediately lowering the bar. They're like, this guy, this vendor's worked with us before, they've got an MSA, I don't have to work with legal to kind of push this through, which is always a pain. I've got good feedback from other teams, and they've also done X, Y, and Z to make the contracting or terms of this easy for me to say yes to. And so I think that's a really important. And we've got I'm taking credit for this. I've got a brilliant guy on my team who is exceptional at doing that, like going through and being like, if I was like, what are the barriers here? What are the reasons that they're saying no? And then you can then take those down and hit them one by one. What are the 5 things? Start at the top and then work your way down. And then eventually you get to something which they can't say no to, because it's as long as what you're doing is actually meaningfully valuable. So there's a clear value to the customer. You de-risked all of the things that mean that that allow them to say no. And ideally you've been able to build credibility either with another company or another organization, but someone that they can point to and say, yeah, these guys aren't charlatans. They've actually done this. So all of that's just hard work. But I do think I've seen other companies sort of perhaps naively just sort of pitch and go like, and then go, I don't understand why they don't want to deal with us. I'm like, well, you haven't really thought through what the risk to them is of using a vendor that they've never used before, both risk and benefit, right? And it's you have to show that there's a huge benefit, and you have to show that you've mitigated as much of the risk as possible for them.
That's really good advice. That's really good advice, man. Because it falls under the understand your customer bucket, doesn't it? Like broadly, but actually you've been more specific there to be like, actually in pharma, it's about risk, and really focus on risk. And that's where you're going to get most of your wins. That's really interesting.
And if I can just to say one of the, I know we're out of time, but this is why as well, I think it's outside of specific elements of clinical development. Imagine if you're, this is why I think the saving money pitch in clinical development is really hard, is because imagine you're a VP, SVP, and you're given responsibility for getting this drug to market. You've got $100 million budget, and somebody comes to you and says, I can save you 10% of your clinical trial budget by using this innovative software. You're betting a pivotal clinical trial on a 10% saving of a vendor that you've not worked with before, when that budget's already been allocated to you, right?
Interesting.
So that money's there to be spent.
Yes.
Are you going to bother taking the risk, which could completely end your career if it all falls apart because this vendor didn't deliver in a clinical trial, for a 10% or 20% saving? I think it's a really hard thing to do unless you've got a huge amount of track record. So that's why, and I mean, that's just one example, but if you think of it from their side, like, why would I do this? I'm going to get promoted. What matters to me is getting this drug approved, reaching the primary endpoint, and getting this drug through marketing authorization. If I'm over budget by 10% because of certain costs, I'm still going to get promoted out of that, because what I've done is created I've got it to that critical point that's going to create value for that company. So,
it also goes to show as well, like when you talk about understand the customer, it's understand the customer, like understand the job title, understand like where they are in their company, and understand these sort of more generic things, but actually understand the person as well. I think is really interesting there in exactly what you just said, because I think that's the other thing, is that we forget, don't we, that so much of this, I mean, you said it multiple times in this, that in fact your company's largely based on these values about people, about these are deals with people, the patients that you're doing deals with, the pharma VPs that you're doing deals with. You're understanding everybody around you as people as much as you are just their position in the ecosystem. And I think the attention to detail that you've just talked about is, even as I'm listening to that, man, I'm thinking like, the people that are in our pipeline, I'm like, there's more than I could, there's more I could do there to actually understand exactly where they are. And whether that's point products to more they are more specifically, or actually just to understand like where I am even in those chats I have with them about where I should be pitching stuff. So actually, no, it's such an interesting point to understand your customer to that level, if you want the wins that you've created. And clearly the team that you've put together and the way that you do things has worked because of the growth that you've had. My final question, man, before I let you go, is with everything that you've got with Vision and what you've got to look forward to and everything that you've got going on right now, what are you most excited about?
It feels to me that we've had fantastic growth, but the thing that's really exciting to me is in the last 3 to 4 months in particular, we've really hit a number of really important kind of validation points that around particularly our cardiometabolic cohort, around scale, and around demonstrating. We're now recruiting in the US, which is a really big milestone. We're also showing that the scale in which we can recruit translates, becomes, to your kind of point that you described earlier, almost limitless, right? We can, the flywheel of value for healthcare providers, patients, and our life science customers is now moving round. And so we can now be much more ambitious about how quickly we scale that network and then how much value we can, and the types of programs we can running in different disease areas. So it's, for me, the ability to, the showing that this translates outside of the UK into the US, and ultimately if it translates into the US and we do it in the UK, it also will work in EU5 and almost any other country, certainly any other Western country. So it's sort of, it's now a case of how quickly do we want to go?
This is it.
And how, and that's nice, right? Because for one of the first times, it's sort of up to us to say how hard do we want to push on the accelerator? How ambitious do we want to be with the programs that we're doing? And that I think is, it's a really exciting position to be in, because up until now, as you've sort of heard from the last hour, a lot of it is, this is the next proof point, and that's the thing that's most important. And then it's another proof point. And now it feels like, of course, there's still more things we'd like to show and prove, but we've done enough of that we're now at a point where we can just say, let's really scale in terms of our ambition. And I think that's a very exciting place to be.
So for the investors listening at those sort of later stage funds, like, whilst you might not need the injection of capital, would you take it?
You'd have a chat. We're definitely considering it, because I think there's some, without sharing too much here, I think there's some quick wins for us in terms of hires and ability to start thinking interestingly more about marketing and thinking more intelligently about our marketing, which would facilitate that acceleration of growth. And so for those investors that are listening, very, very keen to have a chat, because this is about how quickly do we as a organization, not just me, our board, and want to go. And so there's absolutely an opportunity for us to think about raising there.
Awesome. Matt, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, mate. Thank you for coming back
on.
Thanks,
James. I really appreciate it. It's great. Yeah, and all the best with the new little one as well.
Oh, yes. I'll need it, I think. It's been a pleasure, mate. Thank you.
Take care.